I'm Sable Boreth, and I'm at Triangle Square, and I am going to do a presentation today, which I hope will be fun, on women of the Wild West, and there's quite a number of them. I'm going to do Annie Oakley last because I have a lot of information on her, and she's a lot of fun, but they're all fun. So the first one I want to do, now first of all, in the Old West, there were very few women. There were, in 1849, there were 50,000 men in the American West and 5,000 women.
Wow.
So, and a lot of them were prostitutes of those women. But pioneer women were expected to be under the thumb of the men. They did enormous hard work around the house. Can you imagine just cleaning clothes in a river with a stick and beating it? I mean, it's a lot of work, but they weren't, independent. But the women I'm going to talk about were very independent. So the first one is Calamity Jane. Her given name was Martha Canary. She was hard drinking. She posed as a man, gunslinging. She traveled to the West at the age of 13, spent time with men and hunted, and was a really good shot and a fearless rider. She worked as a scout, wearing men's clothes, fighting the natives. Have a seat. Sorry about that. So the first one is Calamity Jane, and I was just going over her. And she worked as a scout, fighting the Native Americans. She posed as a man, was a gunslinger, a good shot. People commented that she handled a horse better than most men. She also toured with the Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West show, which was very famous, with Annie Oakley in it as well, and Sitting Bull was in there. And she was just, and I think I have a photo of her too. And also, let's see. Okay, and the next one I want to talk about is Belle Starr. Now, she was called the Bandit Queen, and she associated with Jesse James and the Younger Brothers. She was the most notorious female outlaw in the Wild West. She had a huge rap sheet. She wore buckskins and boots and a big Stetson hat with an ostrich plume. And when she's not robbing banks with Jesse James, she was in saloons drinking and gambling, and she would gallop down the street shooting off her guns. And her husband was Jim Reed.
Those were real wild women.
And he was shot by the sheriff, and she gave her kids to the relatives and started harboring criminals and robbers. She was in and out of court and prison. And she died while she was shot in the back while riding home to her ranch. They never found out who killed her. These women were made famous in the dime novels. It was all in the late 1800s, and later in movies and musicals. And they challenged the role of women in the 19th century because they were not the usual woman. And another one I want to talk about is Lottie Dino. She was called the Angel of San Antonio. She was a gambler, which she learned from her father, who was a plantation owner, and he taught her how to gamble. She met Johnny Golden and fell for Frank Thurmond. And he went on the lam after he murdered someone, and she followed him and became a criminal. Her ex-husband followed her, and he was killed. She made a reputation over Texas as one of the best gamblers ever, and women didn't even gamble in those days. But she was playing against pro gamblers like Doc Holliday. And one night she was accused of cheating, and they called her Lotta Dinero, and that's how she got her nickname Lottie Dino. And then she got married to a man named Thurmond, and she went respectable. He became vice president of the town bank, and she joined the church for 50 years. She's the inspiration for Miss Kitty in the TV show Gunsmoke, which my father always loved, and we always watched it. Another one is Baby Doc Tabor, born Elizabeth McCourt. She took up married, divorced, and met Horace Tabor. He was rich. He was the lieutenant governor of Colorado. He was married. He got an illegal divorce and secret marriage to Baby Doc, but his wife would not give him a real divorce because she was furious. And finally, later, she agreed to a real divorce, and he publicly married Baby Doc, but she was ostracized by high society, and then he lost his fortune, and she was poor in a shack for the last 30 years of her life. She had a meteoric rise and a meteoric fall. Now, Fanny Porter is very fun. She was born in England. She was a whore by the age of 15, and she was a madam at the age of 20. And her whorehouse was where Butch Cassidy and his men and the Sundance Kid met to relax after they committed crimes. Henry Longbaugh was the Sundance Kid, and he probably met his future wife Etta in her whorehouse as one of the women. And Pinkerton was after Butch Cassidy and Sundance, of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and he was probably one of her customers too. But she never betrayed Butch and Sundance. And after it got too hot for them in America, in the movie with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, the last scene was a big shootout, and we assumed they died in the movie. But in reality, they fled to South America and were never heard from again. And after they left, she retired very mysteriously wealthy, and she was not a madam after that. Nothing is heard about her again. So it looks like they probably gave her a big thank you for harboring them all these years, and she never ratted them out to Pinkerton, even though he tried to find, and I have a photo of her. There's another woman called Charlie Parkhurst, who was one of the greatest stagecoach drivers, and she would outwork men half her age, and everybody thought she was a man, called her Charlie. And she outworked men half her age as a lumberjack, which is, backbreaking physical labor. And everybody thought she was a man, even if they knew her for years, until she died and they discovered she'd been a woman all along, and she'd even voted, which was completely illegal for a woman to vote. And Eleanor Dumont, who's Madame Mustache, which was a beautiful woman with a real serious mustache, and she was young and beautiful, and she had her own casino with no women allowed except herself. And she was very rich, and she lost all her money to a con man, and she tracked him down and shot him. And then she started then she had more casinos, but she was broke, and she became a gambler and a whore and a madam, and she lost her money again and committed suicide by overdosing on morphine because she couldn't bear to face it. Now here's another one. Big Nose Kate was born in Hungary. She was a whore at 16. And these people had no family, it's very hard for a woman to try to earn a living, so they became whores. That's what people did. They do it on Hollywood Boulevard when kids have no way of earning money. So she met Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and she was basically Doc Holliday's wife until he died. She even broke Doc Holliday out of jail by starting a fire and pulling a gun on the guard, and she broke him out of jail. And she was there at the gunfight at OK Corral, too, so that's a very famous movie, too. And she died at age 89 in the Arizona Pioneers home.
Wow.
And Helen Hunt Jackson actually is not a gunslinger or a hooker. She was actually a very courageous woman who wrote Century of Dishonor in 1879 about how the U.S. government had lied and betrayed the Native Americans, which was very unpopular. But she wrote this book in, as I say, 1879, published it herself, and she sent a copy at her own expense to every member of Congress. So she really was trying to help, but nobody paid attention to her for another 100 years. There's a woman named Abigail Scott Duniway who was into women's suffrage in Oregon. She was a leader for women's suffrage in the West, and not until 1912 in Oregon did women vote, and at age 78 she was the first registered female voter in her county. Some of these women were activists for women's rights. Belle Starr is another one. She was born Myra Bell Shirley in 1848. Her mom was a member of the Hatfield and McCoys, with all that big feud they had for 100 years. She was educated in Greek and Latin and Hebrew. She was a teenager in the Civil War and worked for the South. Jesse and Frank James and Cole brothers hid at her farm. In 1866, she married Jim Reed, and they both go on the run. I talked partly about her before. She wore buckskins and moccasins, or a tight black velvet skirt and jacket with high-top boots, a man's Stetson hat with an ostrich plume, and double-holstered twin pistols. And actually, when she was caught and sent to jail, she had money, so she bribed the law to free her men or seduce the guards if they wouldn't be bribed. And she got sent to jail, and she was a model prisoner. She was released after 9 months, went back to crime. She said to a reporter, "I am a friend to any brave and gallant outlaw." And she was arrested a lot, but no evidence was ever, they didn't have enough evidence, so they kept releasing her. And finally, as I said, she was shot in the back. So let's see. Now I want to, and there's another woman named Pearl Hart who was born in Canada. She was an outlaw. One of the last recorded stagecoach robberies was hers. She was the only woman she was caught at that and was the only female inmate in Yuma prison. There were lots of press there taking pictures of her. She would pose for pictures and give interviews while she was in jail. And she was in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show as well. There was a woman named Laura Bullion who was a member of the Butch Cassidy and Sundance Wild Bunch. She participated in the Great Northern Train robbery. She was arrested in 1901. She was Della Rose, or the Rose of the Wild Bunch, the last surviving member, and she died in 1961, which was a very long life. Ella Dumont was Madame Mustache, and she was one of the most notorious gamblers. And now Lillian Smith was a trick shooter, a Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. She was a 15-year rival of Annie Oakley, who was also in the show, and they were rivals with the trick shooting. She performed in front of Queen Victoria, and she still set records until she died in 1930. May Fields was African American. She's the only one of these women who was. She was a slave in 1832, and she was freed. She worked at convents, and she was notorious for drinking, smoking, and gun-toting guns. In 1895, she was the first black female mail carrier by stagecoach, which was a very dangerous job in those days. They always tried to rob the stagecoach. She was called Stagecoach Mary, fearless and reliability in the face of thieves, even wolves. A whole pack of wolves attached to the stagecoach. And there was Rose Dunn, was the Rose of the Cimarron. Her lover was George Newcomb, who was in the Wild Bunch. She traveled with the gang and nursed them, and eventually left outlaw life. Now, Kate Rockwell, this is a fun little story. She was not a gunslinger or a whore. She was a singer and a dancer in the Alaskan Gold Rush. She wore a red chiffon outfit. She made $8,000 a week at her peak. She was performing in Savoy and Orpheum theaters. Her lover and booking agent booked her at all these venues, and he took 10%. And finally, he booked her somewhere, stole all her money, went off and married another woman, and she died poor. and his name was Alexander Pantages, the same guy down the street. He's got his theater here. And he became super rich, an impresario of theaters with her money that he'd stolen, never giving her credit for anything. So I thought that was fun. And there was a woman named Nellie Bly, who was also born Liz Cochran, who was a pioneer and a woman reporter and crusader. She went on Julius Verne's voyage around the world in 80 days, but she did it in 72 days only. We don't hear of her, even though she beat Jules Verne. And Victoria Woodhull, 140 years ago, she ran for president, and by the Equal Rights Party. She also published books on how to operate a brothel and make money at it. And she was arrested in 1872 for indecent literature. And so the movie's Annie Get Your Gun, which is about Annie Oakley, who I'm going to talk about last. Now, and I'll talk about her, and then also, so let's talk about Annie Oakley now, because she is an amazing person. And Annie Oakley was at 15 years old, she was in a shooting contest with her, she was born a Quaker, and she wore calf-length long sleeves, leggings, and split skirts. So she was more feminine than some of the other. That was her trademark. And she was not a criminal. She was a sharpshooter. And she met her husband-to-be in a shooting contest at the age of 15 when she beat him. And she then married Frank Butler a few years later, and they were both in the Wild West show. And she was born in 1865, and her given name was Phoebe Moses. As I said, she was a Quaker, and she's born in 1860, in Ohio. And she met her husband, and they went on to do a lot of shooting demonstrations, and her nickname was Little Sure Shot from Chief Sitting Bull in the Wild West show, because he was in the show too. And she performed in front of royalty in Europe, Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm, the President of France, and in Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany had a cigarette in his mouth, and he told her, shoot that ash out of my cigarette, and she did, as a demonstration that she was a good shot. But and she also tried to get women sharpshooters in the Spanish-American War. She tried to get women armed. She was a big women's rights person. She wanted women to be independent and defend themselves. So she tried to get sharpshooters for the Spanish-American War, but Teddy Roosevelt wouldn't do it. And so she actually let's see. So she had a lot of adversity. She had a. I'm trying to look at my notes here. She was in a train accident. I think it was a train, and she had a lot of adversity, and she overcame a lot of adversity. In 1901, she was in a train accident. She was temporarily paralyzed. She had 5 spine operations in those days, which are even dangerous even today. Wow. But she got back going. She went back shooting. She taught 15,000 women to shoot and defend themselves. She was a big philanthropist for women's rights. She was the first female superstar in America. She hit 100 clay targets in a row from 16 yards at the age of 62. In 1922, she was in another car accident. She had a steel brace on her right leg. 2 years later, in 1924, she set records shooting again. So, amazing woman. And her husband, Butler, loved her very much. And she died of anemia a couple of years later, in 1926, I think. And he stopped eating, and he died 18 days later because he just couldn't bear to live without her. And she wanted women independent and educated. She was a key influence on the image of the American cowgirl. Barbara Stanwyck played her. There was the Annie Get Your Gun movie with Beverly Hutton in 1950. These women were the stuff of legend. They wrote dime novels about them, musicals and movie. Irving Berlin, Annie Get Your Gun, he wrote that in 1946. On stage, Ethel Merman played her. Mary Martin played her in 1957. Jamie Lee Curtis and Reba McEntire. And so she was an amazing woman, and there's just one more, Ma Barker. We all know that name. I knew it. I didn't know anything about her. She was angry even as a girl. Okay, I mean, Ma Barker was a real angry woman. So she was born Kate Barker. She's born in 1873. She had a sort of a wimpy husband, but she had a lot of sons, and she was angry. She let her sons run wild. Her son, she was the matriarch of this gang, which was her sons and her. And they were famous for mindless violence and just shooting up everybody. And she saw Jesse James as a kid ride through her town, and it inspired her to become an outlaw. And she and her sons were lifelong criminals. Her husband, who was mild-mannered, finally left her, and she would never discipline her sons. And in 1932, she and the Barker gang robbed a bank and got $250,000, and this is in 1932. And in 1935, and they got away with it. And a few years later, in 35, the FBI raided their house. They were 4 hours shooting in the house, the FBI. And finally, the FBI ran out of bullets.
Wow.
They had no more ammunition. It was dead silence. And they thought, are we going to go in this house? Are they going to shoot us? So they finally went in the house, and she and her son were dead inside after the FBI ran out of bullets. And there was cash around. So that's my story, and these women are amazing, and I've got some photos. So I just want to thank everybody.